Hello, and welcome to this session on Spring Security or Spring Boot Web Security. And my challenge is that if you follow this session till the end, then you should be able to understand in detail about the internal workings of Spring Security. So I'm starting a series on Spring Security or Spring Boot Web Security, which will help you to understand the internal workings of Spring Security. And in this session, I'm going to show you what is the default behavior of Spring Security, and more importantly, why Spring Security enforces such a default behavior, and how, as a programmer, we can override that default behavior. What are the steps to add Spring Security? Now, the first and the basic step is, of course, to add the Spring Boot Starter Security as a dependency in your Spring Boot project. And the second is we have to configure the authentication, the authorization mechanisms, etc. And the second step is the most important step. So based on the type of security that we want to implement, based on the kind of authentication and authorization that we want to implement, we'll have to configure accordingly. And this series will actually explore all different ways of configuring authentication and authorization of Spring Security. So welcome once again. And finally, before we actually jump into the demo of Spring Security Series 1, or the first module of this series, let me quickly tell you what is meant by a HTTP basic security. So in this module, we are going to see how Spring Security helps you to protect your endpoints using basic HTTP security. So if you do not have time, or if you do not have expertise to implement sophisticated security mechanisms like OAuth protection or even JOT protection, then at least you can implement HTTP basic security, and even that will help to a great extent to protect your endpoints. So what is basic security? In the basic security, your server expects an authorization header, a HTTP header, which has the key by the name authorization, and the value of the key should be two things. One is the word basic, and the second part is a string, which is basically a base64 encoded string. And what should be the content of the base64 encoded string? The content should be the username and the password separated by colon, and the entire part is converted to base64. And in order to convert to base64 encoding, there are many online sites like the one which I listed here, where you can go and put your username and colon password, and you can get the base64 encoded version of that, and that you can pass by the side of this basic string as the value of the authorization header for accessing any Spring Boot endpoint or any endpoint which is protected with HTTP basic security. So now let us go ahead and see how in a Spring Boot project we can implement this HTTP basic security, and how Spring Security actually enforces it internally. Before I start, let me tell you that the entire source code of the demo is available in the description, and please note carefully that the branch for this particular project, for this particular demo, is Spring Boot Basic Security. And also another thing which I want to state is I am not normally doing live coding. I'm already preparing the code and uploading to my GitHub repo and showing it and basically walking you through the code during this session. The reason behind is I just wanted to save time for both me as well as for your time during the live session, during this video session, so that you can get the best use of your time. But if you want to see otherwise, then also please let me know by commenting here. Okay, so let us get started. This is a very simple Spring Boot project. First, I will show you the POM. In this POM, you will see that this Spring Boot Starter Web is there, which is because it is a very simple web starter project. Then this dependency Lombok is there for generating getter, setter, constructors, and this has got no dependency with Spring Boot as such. And the only other dependency is the Spring Boot Starter Security. So with this dependency, I am having a very simple project. As you can see here, the simple project is having just a simple controller with a single endpoint. And if you look at my other Spring Boot projects, the structure is very similar. And then this is the single class, which is the Spring Boot Starter application. And in the resources, in the application YAML, it is a very simple project with the name of the project, and Spring Cloud is not enabled. And all instructions are very clearly written here in the README. So you can clone my branch, and then you can clean the project. Basically, you should package the project and start the project. Let me do that. So let me first set Maven here. And then I will copy this command and run a Maven clean package to create the jar. and then I'm going to run the jar. So now I'm going to run this jar. So now this starts the Spring Boot project, and the most important thing which I want you to see is, because I have included Spring Boot, Spring Web Security, Spring Security Starter, so that is why it has generated a random password, which is a random universal unique ID, UUID, which is printed here corresponding to a user. So now if I'm trying to access any endpoint directly, then that endpoint will not, then basically Spring Boot security will not allow me to access the endpoint. So say for example, if I am trying to do car like this, then it does not allow me to access the endpoint. So what I have to do, again, I have to actually use the user ID password, and the default user ID for Spring Boot security is user, and the password is the password which is generated here. And I will go to the log to see the password. So this is the password. So I will have to copy the password because this is a random password generated. And so this is how the username password should be there. And I have created a very small Java-based utility to base64 encoded that. So this should be the user ID, and the password is this. What this utility does is, it actually creates the base64 encoded version. So it creates a string which starts with basic and then with a space, and then the base64 encoded version of user ID colon password. So if you run this, then you will get exactly that header value which you will have to use for calling the Spring Boot security endpoint. So it will generate this thing. So this is the base64 encoded version. And what I'm going to do is, what I now need to do is, I need to use that as the password. So basically I will have to pass this authorization header here, and so I will have to pass this. And now if I make this request, then this request will go through. See, it has been able to invoke the endpoint. The proof is that it has printed that message. So this is the basic Spring security. This is the default Spring security's behavior. Now, in order to override this default behavior, because why I need to override this default behavior? Because every time I restart Spring security, then it will generate a random password, which is kind of inconvenient for my client, because every time I restart my Spring Boot app, then my client has to use a new password, which is inconvenient. So the better way to actually handle this is to hardcode a username password by using this key value pair in here. So this is a Spring security. So I have configured a username here and a password here. So now if I compile, if I create the package and start the application again, so I will create the package and start the application again, then it will not generate that random password, rather it will use this password. So let me run the application again. It will not generate the random password. See, it has not generated the random password. Now if I want to invoke the application with the previous thing, it will not work, because now the user ID and password both has changed. So how do I now invoke it? I again go back to my that create credentials and copy the user ID and password. What is the user ID password I have given? The user ID is test12 and password is password123. So if I copy test12 and the password is password123. So if I run this program, I will get again that base64 encoded value of the user ID colon password, which I should use. So I need to use this value now. Instead of that, I need to use this value now to call my endpoint. So if I now invoke my endpoint with this credential, see, it has now able to give me the message back. So this is how you can override the default password, and why this default user ID and password. In order to understand this, let us go to a class within Spring Security. So open the class security properties.class, and this class is present. This class is present here in Spring Boot auto configure jar. So if you go inside Spring security properties class, you will see that there is an embedded static user class user, which has the default, which has these 4 properties: the name, password, roles, and password generated. The name, the default name is user, and hence in Spring Security, the default, if you do not override the credentials, the default user ID is user, and the default password is a random password generated. And of course, we can actually override it with any user ID password, and that would be read from this namespace spring.security. Why? Because it is annotated with @configuration properties. So that is why when I actually create an user ID password in this space, Spring Security, and then user, and then name and the password. So user is the inner class. So within the Spring Security, user is the inner class. And within user, the name is this, and then password is this. So if I create something within that space, Spring Security user, then it will override the defaults provided in Spring Security properties. So I hope now you are able to understand why Spring Boot Security, why Spring Security Starter enforces the default user name as user and the default password as a randomly generated password, and how you can override them. So if you think that this video has actually given you value, and if you understood at least one bit of Spring Boot Security, please go ahead and subscribe to my channel and like and share it with your friends and others, because then everybody would benefit. It would be a win-win situation for all of us.